The Present Age, Progress and Anarchy in Modern America by Robert Nisbet, 1988. Excerpts read by Jim Kelly. Chapter 3. The Loose Individual. Repeatedly in history, the combination of war and political centralization leads to a fraying effect upon the social fabric. Threads are loosened by the tightening of power at the center. Dr. Johnson once told Boswell of a man in London he knew who, quote, hung loose upon society, end quote. Loose in the sense of the loose cannon, the ship that slips its hawser, the dog its leash, the individual his accustomed moral restraints. Without a doubt, there are a great many loose individuals in American society at the present time, loose from marriage and the family, from the school, the church, the nation, job, and moral responsibility. What sociologists are prone to call social disintegration is really nothing more than the spectacle of a rising number of individuals playing fast and loose with other individuals in relationships of trust and responsibility. Tocqueville put his finger on political centralization, upon despotism in his word, as the principal cause of the waves of egoism, selfishness, and self-seeking which, from time to time, roll over societies, as has been the case in the West at least since post-Peloponnesian Athens, the age that dismayed Plato and led to the Republic. Tocqueville's own France of the early 19th century was, in many respects, like our own at the present time in America. The chief aspect of the society around him was, for Tocqueville, the eroding away of traditional associations like family, social class, and craft fraternities of economic life. With the disappearance of such associations, the individual is left freer and freer of the restraints which normally establish checks upon behavior. The government, Tocqueville argues, far from trying to impede this erosion of limits, encourages it in the interest of its own power. Money becomes the common denominator of life. As Tocqueville notes in the foreword to his 1856 book, The Old Regime and the French Revolution, money acquires, quote, an extreme mobility, quote, and, quote, everybody is feverishly intent on making it. Love of gain, a fondness for business careers, the desire to get rich at all costs quickly become ruling passions under a despotic government, end quote. Government is the primary force in it all. Such government weakens where it strengthens, weakens normal social authority as it strengthens itself through laws, prohibitions, and taxes. As the blood rushes to the head of society, it leaves anemic the local and regional extremities. The loose individual is a familiar figure in our age, whether in the role of the deviant, delinquent, alienated, anomic, bored, narcissistic, whatever the case may be, he displaces a good deal of social atmosphere. Beginning with the economy, I want to suggest in this chapter some of the haunts of our ubiquitous non-hero. The economy is rich in such figures. I take the word economy in its proper, large sense to include in our day evangelists of the television ministries, the baseball, football, and basketball stars, the university, once as non-economic in function as a monastery, but no longer, and the now thick crowd of ex-generals, ex-admirals, ex-ambassadors, and ex-presidents who, whether in lecture fee, corporate directorship, book authorship, or consulting business, demonstrate how often and quickly the revolving door turns. I shall come back to these individuals, but let us first look at the economy proper, side of property and profit in the old sense. Almost a half-century ago, the distinguished Harvard economist Joseph Schumpeter, in his Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, laid out clearly the essential processes leading to the business and financial scene of the present. Schumpeter referred to an evaporation of property, more particularly an evaporation of industrial property, and an evaporation of consumer property, both reflecting a historical trend of tidal proportions that had been going on in the West and especially in America over the past century. The effect of Schumpeter's evaporation of industrial property, looking at the matter solely from the property holder's viewpoint, was the substitution of the soft property of shares of stocks and bonds for the hard property of land, buildings, and machines that the property holder had once managed, as well as owned in the passive sense, and had been very much a part of in its operation. Implicitly, such a property holder had a distinct stake in society, a role of social responsibility based upon day-to-day mingling with managers, workers, and consumers. Very different is the evaporated property owner, typically possessing shares of stock existing in their own seemingly detached stock market world, independent of their owner's will beyond the buying and selling of the shares. There is far less stake in society in this kind of property. After all, a single safe deposit box can hold many millions of dollars of property, the whole of it requiring little of the attention and responsibility that are mandatory when property exists in the forms of land, buildings, and machinery. An atmosphere of not only impersonality, but irresponsibility is created by evaporated property. The fabled miser hoarding his gold must be changed as metaphor to something like the man about town enjoying his debentures, if we are to do justice to the present age. Less and less seems to depend on the traditional virtues of prudence and social responsibility in the husbanding of one's wealth, and more depends on fortuna. Thus, the atmosphere of the gambling casino begins to permeate not only one's economic, but also one's familial and community life. It is evident that, as the result of the two evaporations, we have the foundation prepared for a very different kind of capitalism from that of a century ago. More and more, capitalism tends to, quote, exalt the monetary unit, quote, over the type of property that theoretically alone gives a monetary unit its value. Central to this evaporation of the two kinds of property, producer and consumer, is the profoundly changed character of the family. Despite the myth of economic man, of the individual enterpriser, the chief dynamism of capitalism was for a long time provided by the middle-class family, a family that, until recently, considered itself as inseparable from the future as from present and past. The typical capitalist did not work for himself. He was not a creature of atomistic self-interest. He worked for his family, meaning chiefly his children, and thereby for the future, so vital to long-run investment. From consecration to, and willingness to sacrifice for, the family then, rather than from a religion, came the entrepreneur's motivation and discipline, his willingness to sacrifice for the future. No abstract, amorphous future was involved. It was literally the future as embodied in children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren that seems to have mattered most to the entrepreneur of old. To work for family, the family in time, necessitates forbearance and sacrifice. You chose between spending annual income on self and its desires, or on future generations who would carry your name proudly for all posterity. If you chose the first, spending course, you were D. Johnson's individual, quote, hanging loose upon society, quote. If the second, saving course, you were Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks of first and founding generation. With the spending course, morals inevitably suffer, meaning particularly the morals of honesty and loyalty to others. Morals are no emanations from heaven, everywhere, from the beginning of conscience in the human race, from the time when the human mind first made the astounding leap from is to ought. What we call morals are firmly set in what the Romans called the mores, customs, and habits of age and sanctity. As a result of the disappearance or sharp reduction of the disciplines upon the self which went inescapably with older kinds of property, and the rise of the present widely spread monetary unit of property, that is, of liquidity, of cash nexus, morality becomes expendable. Who needs it? The loose individual prowls the halls of academia as well as Wall Street these days. What is wrong with the contemporary university will not be made right by encounter sessions on Aristotle and Rousseau under the banner of great books, nor will it be improved by general smatterings, courses aiming to produce the well-informed mind. The university was damaged well before the student mania broke out in the 1960s. Universities, like churches, states, and other major institutions, are to be seen in light of their major functions. When functions change without warning, without the tacit assent of their communities, revolutionary change is almost always in the near offing. The function of the American university had been from its inception teaching. Research, yes, but strictly subordinated to teaching. For the last 40 years, the function has been organized research, teaching on the side, as it were, but only so long as it doesn't distract the research mind from its appointed, bureaucratized duties in laboratory and computer hall. A new academic bourgeoisie appeared on the American campus after World War II with the new higher academic capitalism. The short term in research replaced the old, once unique, long-term pattern of research and scholarship. The reason was manifest. Funding of research institutes and projects tended to be annual, subject to one or two renewals perhaps, but not likely to be renewed for long unless results were quickly evident. Short-term profits, short-term research, and increasingly short-term teaching became the rule. Faculty began to be lauded for their fundraising activities for their research, and such activities soon tended to become an expectation on the part of administrations, even a criterion of promotion. Once the big money, in the form of project and institute research, invaded the campus, two nations tended to form in every faculty. The first, institute and project linked, arrogant in its possession of money that required no sense of obligation to the academic community. And the second, older nation, still committed to the ideal of teaching as well as research, and to the now seemingly trite concept of service. The new nation easily subjugated the old everywhere. The first $1 million of extramural grants to individuals on campuses was far, far too much. Today, $100 billion a year would not be enough to meet the swollen expectations and demands of the institutes, bureaus, and projects which crowd out traditional communities of academic life. Huge amounts of money from the war-enriched foundations as well as from government and from constantly rising appropriations for the public universities from compliant legislatures all combined to change the character of the university from service to cash nexus. It is possible today, not only possible, but increasingly common, for a professor to become actually rich by virtue of his aristocratic position in contemporary society. For centuries in the Western world, universities were primarily institutions for teaching and scholarship in that order. Students comprised the largest single group at any given time in a university. Next was the faculty. Well down in number and significance was the support staff. By entering the higher capitalism after World War II, the university soon found itself with a bewildering corporate infrastructure, better known as bureaucracy, made necessary by the onset of the era of high finance. In the era of competitive finance in today's university world, of big bureaucracy and incessant fundraising, of subordination of teaching to large-scale research, it is hardly surprising that the loose individual thrives. To hang loose upon the university today, fiercely competitive as the academic world had become, makes at least as much sense as in the corporate and financial world. It is not likely that additional courses in the humanities will reduce the number of loose individuals in today's university. Before leaving the contemporary university in America, I must say something about the so-called student revolution of the late 1960s. As I shall shortly indicate, this revolution was much more like the one of the manias of history, crowd crazes, or mental epidemics than it was a revolution in the ordinary sense of that word. The first point is that the student mania of the 1960s was not so much a revolt against academic authority as it was the almost inevitable issue of a prior breakdown in university authority, a breakdown almost implicit in the changes in the university after World War II, which I have just described. The natural authority of the teacher, scholar, and dean had fallen between the cracks opened up by the new academic bourgeoisie and the higher capitalism. It had become apparent by the early 1960s, approximately 2 decades after the war, that the teacher-scholar, the academic department, the academic school or college mattered very little in the new order. What mattered was the institute, the bureau, the center, each by nature a practitioner of grantmanship, of the attracting of large sums of money, in which the university, as a whole, would share. As the center of gravity passed ever more surely from the old authorities to the new, from department, school, faculty, college, each primarily an organization directed at teaching and at students, to the institute, center, and bureau, each anchored in subsidized contract, large-scale research alone, something of an earthquake took place in the historic university. It was not a revolution. Revolutions are hard work, demand discipline and some kind of agenda. The students from Berkeley to Columbia couldn't abide work. They had no agenda. See what an eager television news team might quickly thrust at them to make the stories of vandalism spicier. And they couldn't keep their minds on what they had done and said from one day to the next. To both liberal applauders and conservative critics, the student mania was an exercise in romanticism, in demonstrating how human beings are when stripped of their habits and customs of their civilized existence. Liberals on and off the campus thought, and think to this day, that the disobedience of the students showed them to be beneath all the tyrannizing patterns of middle-class behavior which they were now sloughing off. Rousseauian children of nature, happy little savages. Conservatives were confirmed in their belief that once the social fundament is allowed to crack and to open up fissures, the very foundations of reason and moral decency begin to erode away, pushing human beings ever closer to the void. Faculty members, it must be said here, participated in substantial numbers, not, of course, in the more egregious acts of destruction and vandalism, but in the tender, loving care bestowed upon the filthy speech movement and its analogues of the mania. New depths of the innocence of students were discovered, and with these new depths of blame were attributed to the sadistic cruelty allegedly done these children of God by their vengeful, hate-inspired, tyrannical middle-class American parents. To heal these twisted victims of middle-class conformity, courses were given without assignments or even lectures, in which the entire class would be guaranteed A's. Votes were taken at faculty meetings in which majorities would endorse amnesty in advance for whatever depredations might be wreaked upon libraries and laboratories. And, never to be forgotten, newspaper columnists and editorialists, and especially television sages, all of whom persisted in regarding the kids as innocuous and lovable young idealists. It was no less a personage than Archibald Cox who, after being hired by the Columbia University Board of Trustees to make a thorough investigation of the student turmoil at Columbia, began his report by declaring that the participant students were from the, quote, most idealistic, quote, generation in the history of American education. During World War II and after, a new breed came onto the campuses of the major universities, individuals who were like, but not quite like, teachers and scholars and academic types generally. So far as teaching was concerned, it was something of an irritant, but tolerable when necessary, and not too demanding. Research was the thing, not individual scholarship. Research involving dozens at its best, organized like a military platoon to hunt down its prey, facts and more facts. Leaving the university system to consider the loose individual in public service, it was once thought that government service as a career, whether military or non-military, was its own reward in stability, security, and ultimate pension. One did not go into government service if his life's aim was that of making money. That too was once thought, but no longer. True, it is still impossible to earn or otherwise make sizable sums of money while actually in service, but for almost any admiral or general or civilian equivalent in the non-military areas of government, there is a great deal of money to be had by cannily biding one's time. To see the government career not as a service or calling, but rather as a necessary preface to the real career in business, books, lectures, article, etc., with very high rewards almost guaranteed, that is the way to have one's cake and eat it too. The revolving door between government and corporate America works overtime in the present age, in this late part of the age. Occasionally, greed becomes so imperious that a decent wait of a year or so between status of secretary or White House aide and that of entrepreneur becomes mentally and physically impossible to endure. Then, with a mighty huffing and puffing, the wheels of justice begin turning. Special prosecutors may be appointed, subcommittees of Congress set up, and so forth. Rarely, though, is anyone seriously impeded as he rushes through the revolving door. The word unethical has become, in our loose society, quite possibly the single most difficult word to define in the American language. The vast abundance of liquidity, of money, of cash, and painless credit makes the genuinely heroic, like genuine honor, trust, and fidelity, improbable to say the least. Monetarism is a major theory in economics. It holds that when there is too little money available, growth suffers, and that when there is too much, it suffers also. As a theory, monetarism might be expanded to go beyond the economy and economic growth to culture and cultural growth. Too little liquidity, and money will be hard to find for the minimum condition of any art, literature, or science at all. But too much liquidity, and there is an inundation, a flood before which cultural values begin to erode. It is very hard to find a sacred in culture at this stage of the 20th century. Everything in science, philosophy, art, literature, and drama has seemingly been reduced to the profane. The great sociologist of religion, Emile Durkheim, called the contrast between the sacred and the profane the widest and deepest of all contrasts the human mind is capable of making. Everything above the level of the instinctual, Durkheim concluded, began in human veneration, awe, reverence of the sacred. There was one reason alone that books and songs and dramas and then philosophy and science became as important as they did at the dawn of civilization: the sacred. Because all early art and literature and philosophy were limited to the explication and interpretation of the sacred, these pursuits imbibed some of the essence of the very sacred force that they were contemplating. As Durkheim pointed out, the most basic categories of human thinking, cause, force, time, space, and so forth, all had their origins in religious reflections and ruminations. So did morals and ethics, more particularly in the care given to the sacred essence, be it the perpetual flame at the Greek or Roma hearth, or a protecting God. Honor, trust, loyalty, and fidelity were important, not because they advanced one in life, though they generally did, but because these were qualities vital to the sacred core of all human life. In contrast between the sacred and the profane, Nothing more perfectly epitomized the profane than commerce, and the money by which commerce began to be conducted at an early point in civilization. No greater impiety, act of desecration, and dishonor could be imagined than commercializing the sacred, putting it up for sale, making money from it. Throughout most of history and every civilization known to us, the individual of mere wealth, that is monetary wealth, was on the defensive so far as honor and dignity were concerned. Always the ultimate distinguishing mark of the gentleman, the individual of honor, was his relative separation from money-making as the primary vocation in life. Always where honor and dignity existed, there had to exist also the presumption of the non-monetary as the raison d'etre of one's life. There is still honor, still trust, obligation, loyalty, and the like in American society. We should be hard put if there weren't. Perhaps we shall never know what life would be like in which literally every social act was subject to cash payment, never the bond of love, mutual aid, friendship, trust, and honor. There may well be a point beyond which chaos must reign in an evolution toward a totally monetary regime. But our society and culture today are manifestly closer to the complete cash nexus, the total monetary regime, than they were at the beginning of the 20th century. Sharp, unethical, self-serving practices are, or so the vast bulk of ongoing journalism and social criticism tells us, no longer limited to the ranks of those living on the margins of society. Such once common and respected exclamations as, "You have my word on it," "It's a matter of honor for me," "No contract needed between friends," would today invite derision for the most part. It all comes from the primeval sacred. The sacred can generally spread through parts of nature, books and documents, social classes, some men and not others, some relationships with women and not others, occupations and professions, given acts, and so on. It is the historical and continuing core of culture, including high culture. Without the sacred, all is cash value. As a final note, the beggar had a modicum of honor in the Middle Ages. The tradesman did not. We hang loosely upon the once honored, once cherished, once explored past. What T.S. Eliot in Four Quartets refers to as disowning the past is not an uncommon practice. Concern with the past seemed to be the Greeks of the age of Pericles, concerned with the very reservoirs of creativity. We cannot read the future. Where else but the past can we find respite when the present seems barren of inspiration? The past, correctly approached, is a dynamic composition of myriad human experiences in all kinds of settings. We came out of it, but such is the time-binding capacity of the human species that we never completely get away from it. Nor should we. Present and past are, or should be, fused, not separate worlds. We don't turn to the past as a narcotic, but as a unique treasury of human experiences in different time frames, and also as the setting of the roots of our civilization. The modern idea of progress directs our minds just as much to the past from which we consider the unchartable future. With loss of the real past, in our search for meaning, we unfortunately turn to idle nostalgia. Nostalgia has become epidemic in contemporary American culture. Nostalgia is very different from respect for or genuine intellectual interest in the past. It is really the rust of memory. Nostalgia, we must make no mistake, is good politics as well as good retail sales. For want of a real and used past, politicians blandish us with sentimentalizations of past presidents and events. The great danger of nostalgia is that it narcotizes us and helps prevent a proper sense of past, which is closely woven into the present and helps us guard against destabilizing fads, fashions, and foibles in important areas of thought and allegiance. Quite rightly did Orwell make the calculated destruction and remaking of the historical past the foundation of the totalitarianism of 1984. Like nostalgia, utopianism is one of the major passions of the Western, especially American, mind in our age, and also a favored refuge of those hanging loose upon the present. Marxism and Freudianism have both, under the spell of contemporary utopianism and progressivism, been transformed. The grim Marx of the 1930s in America, the Marx of the Marx-Lenin Institute in the Soviet Union, is no more, at least not in America, not since World War II. He has been replaced by the humanistic Marx, the Marx of the Paris Essays, of alienations, and of all-round jolly fellowship, the toast of the New Left and its greening of America in the 1960s. Utopianism takes many forms in the American 20th century. Those I have just touched upon, that of Woodrow Wilson and his dream of a world safe for democracy, that of Franklin Roosevelt in which he, in happy fellowship with Stalin, would banish war forever. Those of the New Left and Consciousness 1, 2, and 3. And current now, the utopianism of Ronald Reagan and a strategic defense initiative that will negate all future danger of nuclear weapons, just as the dome of a stadium negates all raindrops. The death of socialism in the West opened the field of ideology, of isms, to a number of entries which had not been especially noticeable before the Second World War. Egalitarianism is, by all odds, the most powerful of ideologies in post-war America, and in Great Britain and many parts of Europe as well. The struggles for equality between the genders, between age groups, and between races and ethnic minorities tell a great deal of post-war American history. As long as socialism was the serious dream of the American intellectuals and of large numbers of blue-collar workers at one time, its own relative cohesiveness as doctrine kept any possible scattered fragments of utopia from flying about social space. Today, those disjecta membra are everywhere, most commonly perhaps in the form of issues courses in the grade and the high schools, behind the whole miscellany of women's studies, black studies, Hispanic studies, Jewish studies, consciousness studies, et al., lies the ideal of an equality in the social order that cannot now be easily found, for all the staggering number of laws passed, actions made affirmative, and entitlements given. Socialism held these vagaries to the extent that they even existed as ideals in the minds of most intellectuals, together or kept them down as mere latencies, for exfoliation perhaps in the very distant future. But when, due to the failure of socialism in some countries and the expansion of capitalism in developing countries, the socialist dream passed, the result was a mess of new idols in the marketplace. One utopian offspring to socialism has stood out, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We considered this extraordinary thinker above under the rubric of political power, more pointedly his theory of the general will and its absolute authority over the individual. But along with Rousseau's theory of authority is to be seen the veritable elegy in his political writings to equality and to the revolutionary potential that lies in his combination of the general will and absolute equality. Conservatives who have somehow become enchanted by Rousseau simply have failed to see the overpowering main of the revolutionist in Rousseau, the egalitarian revolutionist. This is a revolution carried on to the very marrow of human nature. Equality, Rousseau tirelessly enjoined, requires revolutionary destruction of the infinity of inequalities contained in human history. It also requires a corporate community based on absolute power. In Rousseau, there are three themes which have a great deal of relevance to contemporary egalitarianism. The first is the virtually nihilistic attitude toward the whole network of social relationships that lie intermediate to the individual and the state. Such relationships, Rousseau tells us in Discourse on Inequality, are the very sources of the inequality we suffer under. The second theme is the perfectibility of the individual once he has broken loose from the corrupting influences of the social relationships just referred to. Third is the theme of power, of the necessity of power in the process of extermination of evil traditions and of the moral development of the individual. We are entering now, though, a potentially critical time in the development of egalitarianism in America. Two forces of uncommon power in human relationships have entered the scene. The first is the inevitable dynamic of rising expectations in nearly all matters of reform. The second is the passage of the egalitarian ethic from the large political and economic areas, the areas of situations it has occupied for over 100 years in this country, to the smaller, more intimate and subjective areas of family, marriage, and other close personal relationships. The great difficulty with equality as a driving force is that it too easily moves from the worthy objective of smiting Philistine inequality, which is tyrannous and discriminatory, to the different objective of smiting mere differentiation of role and function. There is, abstractly viewed, no good reason why the commendable objective of economic equality at home and in the market, wherever, must become a fevered desire to reduce all that differentiates male and female. But it too often does, and sexual differentiation sacrificed to the gods of equality in the marketplace is not exactly what the great pioneering feminists thought. In closing, minimalism, deconstruction, literary theory, narcissism all reflect a hanging loose on culture. In culture, a blanket of subjectivism dropped on American writers and artists shortly after World War II. It is largely under this blanket that such egocentric activities as minimalism and deconstruction operate today. Once free fall, stream of consciousness, and narcissism were declared the right stuff for novelists, poets, and painters, with the author's or artist's God-given self the true hero or protagonist, replete with endless cataloging of feelings about feelings, the way was open for a new chapter in modernism. The great fallacy, ultimately the evil, of subjectivism is that, from it, one comes to be convinced that what lies within consciousness, within one person's consciousness, has more reality, more value, perhaps even more truth than what lies outside the person in the world of external event and change. The objective, the dispassionate, even as ideals, are derided by the subjectivist, who even bends the school of belief that what pupils know or think they know about their feelings, natural impulses, likes and dislikes is more important than what might be taught them about the external world.